we've demonstrated that this scales. It's been run all across all of Livermore Sierra cluster, over 16,000 GPUs, rendering a single data set. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But that was in 2018, so that was quite a while ago that we were able to pull that off. It has lower memory requirements than other tools, both in that it has less dependencies. That also contributes to the lower memory requirements, but also that we try to share memory as much as possible. So make sure people can zero copy things in, etc. Another thing, software engineering wise, that was really important is that we would have less dependencies. So we don't depend on OpenGL or sort of windowing tools like X11, things like that. Those make things harder to build on supercomputers. And we can build with SPAC, and we also have a script that builds without SPAC as well, if you would like to do that. All right, so our project is hosted on GitHub under the Alpine-DAV organization. That was the organization that we established as part of the ECP project that we were part of. You can get to our docs through ascent-dav.org, and there's a landing page for the tutorial that I'll link you to later. And here's the contact info for myself, Nicole, and Emily. Also, these slides are available in our docs. I'll show you actually real quick. Let's do that. So if you are at the tutorial overview, there's a link right at the top that says latest tutorial slides, and that's these. So if you want to reference these in the future, you can do that. All right, before we talk about Ascent itself, I want to make sure everyone has some common understanding of what we're talking about in terms of in situ processing, and contrasting that a little bit with the more predominant post hoc paradigm. So at the end of the day, what do we do with these visualization tools? Well, we hand them some data and we ask them to do things. So in this context, we have to find a way to publish our mesh data to these visualization tools, and we have to have some interface to ask them to do things for us. And then the tools themselves will transform or analyze or render the data, right, and give us pictures or less data or a single number, right, to get answers, right, to get some insight from our data. So these tools support all kinds of different use cases. The most common use case is data exploration. So not every glorious HPC simulation result is going to be landing on the cover of Nature. Unfortunately, most of the time they are subject to the person who ran them, and they're trying to get in there and they're trying to understand some aspects of their simulation run. So a lot of the use cases revolve around tools to help you slice and dice and get into the data and understand things better. We also have quantitative analysis tools that we need, so that could be doing integrals, for example, or lineouts or things like that. So at the end of the day, pictures are beautiful, but some line plots can help us validate a lot of assumptions. Another good use case that these tools are used for, and this includes tools like Ascent, but also a broader set of tools like Visit, is visual debugging. Sometimes if you're a simulation code developer or if you're a simulation code user, you might have a crash or you might have a twisted zone or something like that, and using the visual context along with data about what aspects of the mesh are next to each other, these things can help you really hone down and target a crash and figure out what's going on in your simulation code beyond and alongside traditional debuggers. We also use these tools for comparative analysis. So that would be multiple pictures, trying to look at differences between ensembles, things like that. And then we also have some tools, particularly in Visit, for doing mesh-to-mesh comparisons quantitatively. And finally, people do need to make nice presentation graphics, right? They need to do rendering to produce movies to help people understand concepts going on in simulations. So that's a good use case. Really, the takeaway here is that these tools are used daily by scientists who are running these codes, right? They aren't just used by experts to make pretty pictures, once a year. They're usually used by folks daily to get their job done as part of their general workflow. So you can use these tools both post hoc and in situ. So these are fancy names for after the fact and while the simulation's running, right? So post hoc, which is the way that most things are done, simulation data saved out to a set of files, and then after that, you use different resources to go back and look at those data sets and maybe render pictures or do analysis. And then in situ is different in that it's we're processing it for this analysis or visualization while the data is being generated, and typically in memory, although there's more complicated cases, and we're sharing resources with the simulation application. So if the simulation is already using 16,000 GPUs, it's going to hand us over the data that's on those 16,000 GPUs, and we get to use them as well. So post hoc is the most widely used way that people do things. And effectively what it is you save out tons and tons of files that have the full time history that you care about. And then after the fact, you go in and you prescribe some actions to make pictures, right? And there's a lot of flexibility with post hoc, right? So that's one of the reasons why it's the predominant paradigm. But with in situ, we want to open up some new use cases, and there's a balance of when in situ makes sense as well. So in situ processing expands the data we can access. Basically, the I/O is always going to limit things, right? So if you're looking at per cycle of a physics simulation code, you can't save all of that data out. It's not gonna work, right? So, but in situ, you have less of a overhead when it comes to getting that data because it's already in memory. You might have to make some data transformations to it or do some things to it while it's in memory, but the I/O cost is order of magnitude less because there is no I/O cost. Um, so we already also have the computational power there, right? You don't have to wait to reschedule things. And then ideally, if you get this set up after you've run your simulation code and you've said what you want to do with your analysis, your pictures or your integrals or things are there, right? So that's great. There are some cons to this though. It can be scary because if you don't know exactly what you want to do, it's kind of hard to prescribe it before you run your simulation code. So for exploratory use cases, this is where things are a little bit harder because, if you were going to use a post hoc tool, you could go in, you could set slice planes wherever you like, and you could iterate, maybe do it, 50 times and get the right one. But when you're going to run in situ, you're still going to have to run some sort of iterative loop like that, which involves running the simulation code. It also is a little bit more complex in that you are linking this into your simulation code. So build wise, you don't just download an off the shelf application to run. You have to get that linked into your code. And then there are other constraints. So the simulation code itself loves to use memory, loves to use all those resources, right? So it's going to want to use all the GPU memories there. Well, you want to do some rendering, so you need that too. So there are constraints in terms of not necessarily fighting for those resources, but sharing those resources. At the end of the day, you have to look at what's going to work. And depending on your use cases, the I/O versus compute ratios could favor in situ, or there could just be some simplifying steps in your workflow that help you do in situ, right? Um, so this is just a notional case. If it takes a long time to save things to the file system, well, it might be possible to do a lot of in situ actions in that same time, right? There's another flavor of in situ processing called in transit that's a little bit more complicated, and that can allow you to overlap the compute with more simulation. So sorry, overlap the computer visualization with some of the simulation if you can transfer the data quickly to another set of resources. And again, whether this makes sense or not, and this added complexity really depends on some of the use cases that you're doing. If you want to render one picture per cycle or per m cycles, it's probably not going to make sense to send the data off somewhere else to another part of the supercomputer because your GPU is already there and it can do that very quickly. But now if you want to render, say, 100 different pictures of that, maybe 100 different angles, it might make a lot of sense to send that somewhere else so your simulation can continue to move on. And it gets complicated. That's the answer. And I think there's this nice effort by the community to try to figure out and map not just that complexity but the space, right? And in terms of different ways you could describe how in situ can work. So if you're curious, you can check out this paper. So back to where we were here. We need to pass simulation, mesh data, and user actions to in situ visualization tools. Great. So how do we do that? That's the first question we have, and you'll learn how to do this as part of the tutorial. So one of the fundamental things that we realized when working on Ascent and then also working on Conduit, which is a tool I'm about to talk about, was that there is a lot of complexity in terms of bridging the gap between a simulation data model, so the data structures in a simulation, and a general purpose tool like Ascent or even a tool like Visit, right? So a lot of them have their own in-memory mesh data models, right? They're invented by a handful of people, and they have good reasons for their custom data structures and stuff like that. But that is in itself a set of complexity that we have. So other tools or simulation codes themselves use mesh focused toolkits and frameworks, APIs. There's a lot of them out there. So VTK, VTKM, MFEM, Samurai, which is an AMR framework, AMRX. So there's lots and lots of these shared capabilities that people use, and that's a great entry point. But yeah, but there's a lot of them, right? So there's also a whole set of other tools that have no idea what a mesh is, right? They really have no idea what a computational mesh is, partitioning space and all these things. They're just used to chunking through arrays without as much context. So things like NumPy, PyTorch, although PyTorch, to some extent can deal with structured arrays and images and stuff like that, but that's not the full complexity of like an AMR mesh, right? So getting data into those tools is really hard from the mesh land, which might be partitioned up. So the observation was a single full-fledged API was never gonna, there wasn't gonna be one set of things to unite them all. So we created a way that made it easy to adapt data from multiple data models. Rather than providing a full-fledged thing that can do everything for you, we provided an interface, and this interface is called the Conduit Mesh Blueprint. So to answer the first question, we're going to use this tool called Conduit, which you'll learn about. So Conduit's another project that our group develops. So it's an API for in-memory data description. So it allows you to basically create hierarchical paths with words in them. And within those words, you can build trees and you can hang off of the trees leaves that have arrays. And those arrays can be described without copying them. We also refer to this as zero copy, right? So that's important. If you already have a huge set of data for describing, say, your pressure on your mesh, you want to just hand that straight over. You don't want to have to make a copy of it to use these tools. It also provides C, C++, Fortran, Python APIs, and that's what underpins the way we're able to do everything in Ascent, actually. On top of this in-memory data description API, we have common conventions for exchanging data, notably simulation meshes, right? So with the core conduit capability, you can build any type of little tree you want. You can think of it as like JSON or even YAML to some extent. But we do need some rules for people on either side of the equation understanding how to interpret that data. So we have something called the blueprint or the mesh blueprint, which describes simulation meshes, and there's some rules there, and you'll learn about that today. So once we have this nice in-memory data description, we can have other use cases fall out from that. So things like I/O, even checkpoint restore, or moving things around with MPI become a lot easier because we can just describe it as it is in memory, and then we're able to move things pretty easily because we know all the details. So the blueprint library within Conduit helps us do this data sharing and helps us establish these shared conventions. The primary thing you'll be learning about are meshes, right, and simulation meshes. Another important aspect of this is that this library comes with ways to validate those, and it also comes with examples for all the different things that the interface supports. So you're going to get several examples of these as we go through this. But this is a very simple example here of an unstructured mesh with two tetrahedra, just to give you an idea. So we got that answer. Blueprint mesh data is how we pass data along, and also Visit has a way to read blueprint mesh data that's actually written to HDF5, so that's nice. So another question is, how do we pass user actions to Ascent? And that's going to be, you're going to see the recipe for this throughout the tutorial a lot. So we also use Conduit to do this. So Conduit allows us to build this actions API that you can use in all these different languages. And also you can prescribe via YAML, which is very handy. So you're going to get to learn all about that. So that's to prime the pump. Now we're at a little bit of the history of Ascent. So I'm gonna go into this. If there are any questions, please 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 type in chat and we can answer them. I'm sure we'll have some questions whenever we get to the hands-on part. You already saw this. This is our introduction to Ascent slide. Now we'll get more into what Ascent is capable of. So we do have kind of the bread and butter of visualization tools that you would need. So things like clipping, ISO volumes, which is sub volumes between ISO contours, thresholds, ISO contours themselves, slicing, pseudo color rendering, which is what most people use, right? You're prescribing a color map to some scalar field that's distributed over the mesh. Volume rendering, which is more like an integral, right, through the mesh and accumulating as it goes through in mesh plots. These all use ray tracing, so as opposed to rasterization. So underneath the hood, we use multiple things to accomplish this. So VTKM is a project that was also a prominent ECP project, provides a lot of the performance portable GPU algorithms we use under the hood. So for like clipping and isosurface, etc. We use Raja to implement aspects of the interface for some of our expressions. So that's another performance portability layer that's more general. It's not focused on meshes, but it gives us a way to write arbitrary algorithms. We also use MFIM, which if you'd like to learn about, you can learn about this Thursday in the next tutorial. A high order finite element toolkit. And we have a unique capability called Double Ray, which is it's a renderer specifically for high order meshes. So curvy meshes is the way to think about it. And what's different about Devil Ray versus other rendering techniques is often when you do high order, you use a subdivision approach. You go through and you take this high order mesh and you continue to represent it as low order elements and subdivide them further and further and further in order to get to a good picture. Well, Devil Ray actually solves kind of the high order equations and does direct ray intersection with the high order meshes themselves. We like to make pictures, but we like to do other things as well. So other analysis use cases. So derived fields are important. That's the capability to, given that you publish some things from your data set to a tool like Ascent, you could compose new fields with some primitives. This example shows doing a vorticity combining gradient with some different operations. Time histories, so getting maximum out over time. Line outs, so that's spatially prescribing where you want to sample, and spatial binning, which is a collapsing method. We spent a lot of time in Ascent and actually, yeah, going through and trying to figure out how to solve this problem of people are scared. They don't want to use in situ tools because they don't feel like they have flexibility. So we spent a lot of time and a lot of research into this concept of triggers, which is pretty simple. You effectively want to have some prescription for when something interesting happens. I would like to do something, right? So this case here is like a condition where the entropy jumps. We'll say if that happens, you'd like to render some pictures or you'd like to save out some data, right? So we spent a lot on the research in terms of building an infrastructure to support that. And extracts are a way of getting things out. There's several different ways to do this. HDF5 files and blueprint flavored HDF5 files, we'll call them, is a very common way. Scalar images are interesting in that they are effectively a ray traced render, but instead of applying a color map, you're getting out the floating point values. It's like a floating point image, and then you could apply a new color map after the fact, or you could do some other analysis, maybe put it into a neural network for some machine learning stuff. Cinema databases we'll talk about. They involve rendering multiple images in basically sweeping cameras and creating an image database that allows you to have pseudo interactivity. And we also have ways to get to Python and to Jupyter. So we've been working to integrate lots of codes with Ascent. In ECP land, we focused on the co-design centers. So SEED was one of them, then the AMREX co-design center was another. And that was a good way to get into a lot of codes, but we'll also help people individually get things into their codes. Couple success stories. So this is an example from ECP running on the Frontier system. So in this case, we were using HIP and on AMD GPUs doing zero copy, and we use Raja and VTKM in order to run our algorithms, right? And this is let me show this movie here. This is one of the visualizations we created, which is actually pretty complicated. It's a laser Wakefield simulation, and effectively you have these different fields that are going through the plasma, and there's a set of little green little green dots there that are hard to see, but they're getting very excited. And one of the reasons why this is a little bit hard is the frame of reference is complicated. This is a very complicated set of interacting physics, but this was a really cool result, and Nicole helped make all this happen. All right, you go to the next. Couple other things we've been doing. If you'd like to compare your simulations to real life experiments, one such real life experiment is a Visar, which gives you the idea of how fast things are moving at a physical interface, and we can use tools like lineouts to help do that in Ascent. Another example of reality versus simulation comparison, if you have a experimental setup that gives you radiographs of something that's happening very quickly, then you can do effectively a simulated radiograph in a tool like Ascent, right? So this example is an example that we lovingly call the big laser tiny box, because there is a very large laser and there's a very small box. Inside that box, there is a interface layer that has like a perturbation, and when the laser shocks it, you get this Kelvin-Helmholtz roll-up, which is really cool. And at the top, you can see some simulated radiographs. On the bottom, you can see experimental radiographs, the same setup. We've also been playing with giving people workflow tools like Jupyter Lab. So actually, that's kind of what this tutorial would look like when you're playing with those. So the ability to go through and prototype things with Jupyter Lab is nice. And I mentioned this before, so this was a simulation that we ran. It's an idealized ICF-like simulation of Rayleigh-Taylor instability. And this was when Sierra, which is one of the large systems at Livermore, our previous advanced technology system. It's still in production, but we're seeding the El Capitan machine now. But this was before it was fully accepted. We were able to run this simulation to shake out the machine, and that was really cool because the simulation code was able to go across all these GPUs, and we were able to use them as well and do things like ray tracing and clipping. Okay, so we're getting to the more fun part now. So we're going to do to learn actually how to use the tool, right? So in order to do that, you're going to learn about Conduit, because Conduit really everything you do in Ascent's API leverages Conduit. You'll learn about how to get your data into Ascent. So that's for folks that already have an integration into their code, maybe that's less interesting, but you'll learn something about how we present data. And then a lot of the rest of the tutorial will spend talking about capabilities of Ascent and how you leverage them, right? How you ask Ascent to do things. So the tutorial examples are all part of our documentation. If you build and install Ascent yourself, then you will get all of these as well. So let me just, so we'll get to this in a second, but if you go to ascent-dav.org and click on tutorial, you'll get to all this documentation. Basically, to get us started, Ascent has 5 top-level functions that we use. So open and close are initializing and finalizing. So for example, if you're running with an MPI case, open would be where you provide the MPI communicator, and close tells Ascent to clean up some things. Publish is where you hand Ascent your mesh data. So once you've described your meshes, you call the publish function. Execute is where you tell or politely ask Ascent what to do. And so we'll spend a lot of time on what the different actions look like that you can pass to that. And then info gives you details about Ascent's last operation. So with these set of things, open and close are pretty basic, initialize and finalize. But with publish, execute, and info, you can hand your data to Ascent, ask it to do anything, and then ask it for information about anything it just did. And with those three methods, you can implement a lot of different workflows. But obviously I've cheated here somewhat, right? I said, this looks easy. You just pass these 3 things in. But what do these things look like? So really, these things take a conduit tree, which I mentioned earlier. So I talked about this already, but how does Ascent use conduit? Well, it provides support for C, C++, Python, and Fortran. It gives us this ability to use YAML, which is heavily used. It supports zero copy. So again, if you have, say, a pressure field that's already allocated, you don't want to copy that. You'd like to just describe it and hand it over to a tool like Ascent. And then it also provides the guidelines for how we present meshes. So I'm going to actually, yeah, so we'll do this real quick. So this example you're going to see in C++. Let's see here, any questions? Yeah, so I'll answer some questions when we get to when we get to a break here, but thanks, keep them coming. So I'm going to show you the C++ example, which is the first light example. So this is basically just making a first picture with an example mesh. Show it to you in C++, and then the rest of the time we're going to be working in Python. The Python stuff is very similar to C++, so that's good. It's good for the C++ folks because it makes it a little bit easier. So in this example, we're going to provide an example mesh. So what we do is, if this was your simulation code, you'd be instrumenting, say, your main loop or wherever your simulation data is evolving. In our case, we're creating an example mesh using something built into Conduit. So this creates an unstructured mesh with some hexes. We're going to create an an instance of Ascent, right, and open it. We're not doing MPI in this case, so it's just a very simple call. We hand that mesh to Ascent. And then we need to ask Ascent what to do, or tell it what to do, I guess. So in this example, we also are using Conduit, and we're building a set of actions. So rather than look at the details here, I think the best way to think about this is there's always a way to do equivalently think about a YAML representation of this. I mean, this is kind of how Ascent builds these hierarchical structures. They can be naturally translated to YAML. So what we're doing here is we're adding a scene and we're making a picture, right? And we have some different setups for this. And we ask it to do this for us, and then ta-da, we get a picture. Right. So so that's the basics. That's what it takes to use Ascent. We have 5 different things that you'll learn about. So these are kind of the building blocks in terms of thinking about how to compose what you want to do. So scenes, which give you pictures, pipelines, which allow you to change things, extracts, which get things out of Ascent, queries allow you to ask questions. So like summarization questions, usually like maximum pressure, or triggers, which I talked about, adapt actions. And we have examples of all these. So we're going to hop into the notebooks here. If you are on site at Livermore, you will probably have to use this EOR process, which may or may not be successful. So these notebooks are hosted on AWS and random IP addresses. Or if you're somewhere else and you have a VPN, it's possible that your VPN might block these IP addresses. So you probably have to drop. If you have Docker, you can also run these yourself, either on a Mac or an ARM Mac or an x86 system. We could help you with that as well. But the easiest way by far is to get one of these cloud-hosted instances. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start here. Let me paste this into chat. And if you come here, you'll see this page, and this page also gives you the instructions if you had Docker for running them yourselves. So if you have not pulled this before, this will pull the image and start running it. It might take a little while. The image is decent sized. And then you can connect with localhost. What I want folks to do is click on this guy and then click request a server, and you should grab a server. So let's do that, and let's see if people are successful doing that so far. Yeah, cool. And a couple other questions. So question is, so Ascent actions can be JSON. We usually show YAML because it's a little bit more friendly to humans. So that's a choice. Yeah, so Nicole answered that. So questions, differences between GLViz and Ascent. So one of the big differences between Ascent and GLViz is that it can do scalable rendering, up to the size of the entire supercomputer. So it's going to take advantage of all the different resources, and it is truly running in memory. So GeoViz has different ways where it pipes data around and it can do things, but Ascent has this scalable rendering, and it also has these scalable algorithms for doing a lot more visualization operations. So that's my answer. Okay, so we got some people, 7 people. So we can grab more. Go for it. I fired up a lot of them, so go ahead and grab them. Okay, so here we go. Let me get this for you, Eric. and it might take you a little while for this to go through. This is what it used to be. I'm not on VPN, so I can't tell you if that's correct, but this is what it used to be here. And you have to have a they ask for a justification. The justification is that you're using Amazon Web Services for a tutorial to learn about open source tools, and that should be fine. Any other questions before we dive into the hands-on aspect? Okay. So if you grabbed one of these servers, you will land at a page that looks like this. And actually, I'm going to just share I'm going to shrink what I share here because it'll be better, I think, for me. And it's asking you for a password. The password is learn all lowercase. And if you type that in, you will land here, and you will see a set of Jupyter notebooks on the left, and this is a Jupyter Lab server. Anyone having a problem with getting set up with this? All right, I'm going to assume everyone's good. So in these are the same examples again that you could see in C++ or Python, but they're factored into Jupyter notebooks to make it a little bit easier for us. So we're going to start with the first notebook, which is called Ascent First Light. So this is exactly what we saw in C++, but now it's Python, using the Python API. So in C++ we were doing pound include Ascent and conduit, and here we do imports in Python. So for this example, and if most people are familiar with notebooks, but if just in case you aren't, you open this notebook and then you hit Shift Enter to execute these cells. And as you execute these cells, you'll get different results, right? So I'm going to hit Shift Enter to get ourselves set up. And then again, the first thing that we do is we create an example mesh that we're going to hand to Ascent. So we again create this this set of hexes, an unstructured mesh of hexes. And we create the Ascent instance. Is this big enough for people, or should I make it a little bit bigger? It's probably, let me see. We're going to create an Ascent instance here. One thing that we do a little bit different than we did in the C++ example is we're using some options to open Ascent. So by default, Ascent will not throw exceptions or will not bug you if something goes wrong. This is because oftentimes people want their simulation codes to keep going even if there's a problem with their in situ stuff, but you can control that. So we have it here set up to say, hey, I actually want to see the exceptions. So if something's wrong, it will propagate to the Python environment and we can get those errors. So here we created Ascent and we're setting it up with some options. We are publishing our mesh, which again, we just created with that utility function and conduit. And then we're creating our actions. So again, our goal here is to make a picture. So we're doing that through the scenes construct that Ascent provides. So we add a scene, and there you'll see throughout all this, there's you're building up these trees, and the key here is that these trees, some of them the hierarchy are names that you can provide for you, and some of them are expected names. So for example, when you add a scene, it's going to expect there to be scenes and then have some structure. The structure here is you can name the scene because you could have 10 scenes if you'd like to, but every scene has to have some plots, and then every plot, has to have a unique name and then different parameters to it. So in this case, we're going to make a pseudo color, and we're going to render a field that's in our data set called braid. Again, this is the conduit way to construct this, but there's always this way of thinking about it in terms of YAML. So you'll see that when I execute this. So we get our scene here, or sorry, we get our YAML here, and here it is. This is effectively what we're asking it to do. One of the cool things about these Jupyter notebooks is using the info API that I talked about that Ascent provides. We can get all the information about what just happened, and we can create a little widget to display that. So that's what you'll see here if you execute this. This widget shows you all the renders you made. It also shows you the actions. If there was an error here, you would get a different output. So that's what we saw in C++. This is what it looks like in Python. It's very similar. So if you'd like to, so we're gonna move on to more examples now. But if you'd like to understand this a little bit more, here's some more exercises that you can do And these are nice to help you confirm that you understand. So one of the examples here is, hey, why don't you go back and change which field is plotted and see what it looks like. Actually, I'll do that one for you. So to convince you that it's a fun thing to do. So there is also a field called radial. If we do this, you'll see you get a different picture here. And we have exercise solutions for all these exercises. So if you want to go in and learn a little bit more about or tweak a little bit things, you can do those. I encourage you to do that. All right, so I'm going to move on here. Any questions? Are we okay? All right, I'm going to move on here. So again, to learn Ascent, you have to learn about conduit just a little bit. It's not that much, but there are some important constructs you need to learn, namely how to get around with handing data around and zero copying data, and then also how to present a mesh in a way that something like Ascent would understand. So in Python, we use NumPy as, NumPy arrays as kind of the leaf representation of conduit trees. In C++, obviously, those don't exist. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. We did create classes in C++ that make it pretty easy still to do things with arrays. So and there's different use cases for that. But in this case, everything you'll see will be using NumPy or things like strings. Simply spoken, the core of the data model here is really a key value tree. So you can think of it as, key values, but there's hierarchy involved. So basic use of a conduit node, you can have a named key and you can set it to a value, in this case, a string. And then, oops, I forgot to do my first cell. I apologize. And if you do that, then you'll get, if you look at the YAML representation, you'll get this simple representation here. But a lot of the power comes from imposing this tree structure. So having a hierarchy, right? So anytime you have these slashes, you are imposing a hierarchy. Now, this says dir1, dir2, val1. That's just sort of an analogy. There's no file system here, right? This is just to help you think about things in terms of this. But when you have the slashes, you get this hierarchical embedding. And this allows you to create trees with whatever keys you'd like, right? And that's very descriptive. So again, Python, we're dealing with NumPy. So you'll see here where we have NumPy objects, and we're going to put those in our conduit tree. This example, we show the first few things of a Fibonacci series, right? So in this example, we set things up with a NumPy array, and we call set. Whenever we call set, or actually whenever we use the assignment operator, there's copy semantics here, which means that conduit is going to see that data and then copy it. And then we will show you how to do this without copying in the next one. So if I run this, we get a very simple representation here. We have a named entry that has this array, right, with numeric values. So the corollary to set is set external. So we have this, and that's how you can do zero copy, right? So instead of actually copying the data when you call set external, it knows how to describe the data such that conduit can access it. So this example here that we're going to show is just contrasting the deep copy versus shallow copy, or shallow copy. You can think of zero copy, right? There's several different terms for this, but in this example, we have two NumPy arrays that are effectively the same, and we put those into the conduit nodes, one with set, which causes a copy, one with set external, and then after the fact, we modify the original NumPy array, and the takeaway here is the one that was set external. Obviously, this is going to impact what conduit sees, and this one is not because it was copied before that happened. So here we go. So here you can see that the last entry ends up being -1, and the one that was zero copied or shallow copied. So there's another exercise here that shows you how to create different types of trees, which I think you can experiment with. So in effect, it shows you how to use lists, and lists are something that we do use a lot in the Conduit API, or sorry, the Ascent API for actions. All right. Next, I'm going to show you some blueprint examples. So again, mesh blueprint is the way we present mesh data. And this will show you, so things get more complicated if you get into AMR and all these other things, but this will show you the very basics and give you an idea of how we can use zero copy, how we can assemble meshes to present them to Ascent. So let's get started here. The simplest mesh you can create is a uniform grid. So uniform grid has an implicit specification for both the number of points and then how they're painted through space is the way I would describe it. So in terms of a uniform grid, we need to tell it where the points in space are, and we need to give it a recipe for what those points in space are, or how they're going to be distributed. So we do this with a set of common things that the blueprint provides. So the first is chord sets, meaning points in space. And then in this case, we are creating a uniform chord set, which again, we have this kind of recipe for how this is going to dance through space. So we give it the number of points, where they're anchored, and then the dx, dy, dz. And then, as you can imagine, this creates a cube in space of points. And then we also need to know how those points are sewed together, or how they're connected with elements. In this case, we use topologies to do that. In this case, we can infer the topology from a uniform chord set. So that's a detail that makes it simple for this case. One important thing here is this name chords is a name that I picked, and we use names within the tree basically to link between things. So our topology has to know what chord set it's defined on. So in this case, this name chords here is connected to this chords here, right? So it knows. And one other thing we do here is we add a field. So fields are, parameters that are painted onto the mesh. They usually represent some state of the simulation, like velocity, density, pressure, what have you. In this case, we're just going to create a sample field that just alternates between two values just to give you an idea. So if I run this, and we also did a zero copy here, we're not really going to show why that's important, but this is just to demonstrate that you can. Now, we can do 2YAML, and we can see this mesh represented as YAML. I do not recommend you do this if it is a 100 billion element mesh, right? That would be a bad idea to turn into the text. But for this example, this is a very, very good way to see it. So this hierarchy that we created ends up looking like this. We have our coordinates, our topologies, and then we have our field, and the bulk of these values are the field values that are painted across this mesh here. All right, good news. So we have rules that we have to follow. So we need someone to help us understand that we did follow those rules, right? And this is a runtime operation that we provide inside of Conduit to do this. So the good news is you can call verify, and verify will tell you if everything's okay. And the other good news is if it's not okay, it'll tell you why. So in this example, this is a tutorial example. So we did the right thing. We verify it and successfully, but I want to show you an example of what if we broke one of the rules, right? The chord set needs to have a type, but what if I had a typo instead, right? So if I do this and I print it again, let's scroll up, you can see that I in fact have a typo instead of type in that tree. And I try my verify, it will tell us that something went wrong, right? And it basically will go through and validate all the different aspects of what you're trying to present, and it'll tell you where things went wrong. So in this case, we have chord sets. They're not valid because our chords is bad and it's missing type because we had typo instead of type. So we can go back to fix that. Usually what you do is you get this stuff all set up, and then in your simulation code, you call verify to make sure that there aren't any surprises. Ascent will actually call verify for you as well, but it's good to do it yourself. So we built this mesh. Now we want to look at it. This is exactly what you saw before, except with our sample mesh. We're going to add a scene, make a pseudo color plot of a field, and execute that. And here's what it looks like. So so uniform grid, very simple case. That's what it looks like in terms of presenting the data. Next example I want to show is how to do an unstructured mesh. So unstructured mesh, we have explicit coordinates, which means instead of using a recipe for how they're dancing through space, we're using a recipe, or not, we're using explicit points in space. We're saying that here's all the points. And then we're also going to use explicit topology, meaning that we're going to say, hey, these are these type of elements, and they use these chord sets via an index indirection. So again, we have a chord set. Our name for it is chords. This is a little bit different. We have 3 XYZ values that are going to be those points in space, and we're zero copying them in. And then we're going to have an unstructured topology. So again, there's some rules for what that means. Again, linked to this chord set. And here's our shape which we're going to use tetrahedras, and here's our connectivity array. In addition, we're going to create two fields. We only have two elements here, two tets. It's the example that was shown earlier. And there's really just it's a 0, 1, 1, 0, it flips flops. So the fields aren't that interesting, but it's just to give you an idea of the two different tets in this. So if we take a look at the YAML representation of this, you can see we have our chord sets again, our mesh, and we have our var1, var2. And we verify successfully. That's great. And then let's take a look at it. Again, we're just going to make a plot and render it out. We're looking at var1. Here's what we get. So if I were to change this to var2, you will see something that, let's see, it flips, sorry, it flips the values of the fields. So the third example here just changes a field. So it starts with the braid example and it changes the field such that it's kind of more time varying, a little bit more interesting. So what we're doing here is we're taking an existing mesh and just updating that the array that has those field values with just some kind of fancy looking trigonometry stuff. It's not, there's nothing physical here. So let me show you this. And then while we do that, so it's running different time steps, and each time step it's using Ascent to render out a picture. And if we look at this, we get our time varying mesh here that we rendered out. So again, we're looking at all the images that Ascent presented in terms with this little UI. And here is where I will hand over to Nicole, because Nicole is going to start going into details of scenes, right, Nicole?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. And if you have any questions, I guess we can stop for questions if folks have. I don't see any in the chat. So, but I'd be happy to answer any. If anything's confusing, if you want us to go back over things, we have a lot of time. So please.
Okay, cool. So we will get started with scenes. So we've kind of already seen a bit of scenes,
So Nicole, let's make it bigger. Yeah, make it
bigger.
Yeah, a lot bigger. Yeah.
Make it bigger.
Yeah. Yep, that's
okay,
good.
Great.
That's good.
Perfect. Thank you. So we saw a bit of scenes from Cyrus, and this is, one of our sinks we can think about of getting our data out of Ascent. So making images, it's a great way to get our data out. So let's just start with an easy example. We're going to start with that tet mesh that we've already seen before and load that all up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use multiple scenes to render different variables. So let's see. So for our action, we're going to have scenes. We're going to have add scenes. Our first type, so we can do a pseudo-color plot, we can do a mesh plot, or we can do a volume rendering plot. So let's just stick with some pseudo-color plots. We're going to render two different variables. So for our first scene, we have S1. For our plots, we're going to have one plot, and the type is going to be pseudo-color. For this plot, we need to specify the field that we want to render, and then for that scene, we're going to give it an image name. And then for our second scene, for our second variable that we want to render, right? So we're going to declare this S2 to make it different from our S1. Our first scene, that's going to have a plot. This plot is also going to be type pseudo-color, but we're going to point to the field var2, and then we're going to give it a different image name. So if we execute this, we can look at our conduit tree. So we see our add scenes, we see our first scene, our second scene, S1 and S2, our two pseudo-color plots, and our two fields with their different image names. So we can look at these images, and we saw Cyrus kind of switch back and forth, but it was hard to tell, but you see, we just switch. They're just mirror images of each other. So go ahead and close out this example. So now let's render multiple plots to a single image. So there we saw two different images, but now we're going to render two different plots on a single image. So here we're just going to have one scene, a single S1, but multiple plots. So here for our first plot P1, this is going to be type pseudo-color. We're going to be using that same mesh as before. So we're going to use var1 as our field that we want to plot. And then on top of that, let's additionally plot our mesh. And then that's also on part of our scene 1. But now, since it's a second plot, we have P2 here. And then type being mesh. And then for this single scene, we give it an image name. Go ahead and look at our action tree. Perfect, add scene. Here, we only have a single scene S1, but we have two plots, P1 and P2, one doing a pseudo-color and one doing a mesh. We can look, and pretty similar to what we had before, but now we have this white outline around our data for the mesh plot. Okay, so for our third example, don't know what that did. Okay, so for our third example, we're going to adjust our camera parameters. So let's say we have a scene, default camera parameter, it's just straight on the data, focused towards the center of it down the z-axis. Maybe we want to change some of those parameters. So let's use same var1, var2. Excuse me, we're just going to use var1, but let's render it in two different ways. So it's going to be a single scene. So we're going to set up our scene. It's going to be type pseudocolor. We're going to be rendering var1, but what we're going to do is we're going to set up two different renders. So now we can specify two different camera points and render out two different images of a single scene. For the scene, we're going to declare our render. So for our first render, our first image, we're going to give it a specific name, and then we're going to change the camera parameter of the azimuth to 10. And then for our second scene, or excuse me, for our first scene, it hasn't changed. We're still doing a pseudocolor of R1, but for our second render, to make a second image, we need to give it a second image name for R2. And then for this image, we're going to also change the camera, but in this instance, we're going to change the zoom. So we're going to zoom in on our data. You can look at our tree. So great, we're adding our scene. We have our single scene. We have our single plot, but now we are doing two different renders, so making two images of that single scene. So we can look at what we did. So here's our first image where we changed that viewing angle. We changed our azimuth. And then if we go to our second one, we should have a very zoomed in. Yes, so we're back to our default camera, but now we are zoomed in on our data. So for our next example, let's go ahead and change our color table. So Ascent has a couple different options for color table. So this falls under our plot parameters. For this example, we'll render two different scenes and we'll change our color tables for both var1. So scene 1, let's just do a pseudocolor plot. Our field will be var1, but now we have this color table parameter where we can specify viridis, and we'll give it an image name to mirror that. And then we can have a second scene. Again, we'll do a pseudocolor plot of var1, and for this, we'll change the color table to be inferno. So here we have, scene 1, scene 2, our plots that we're defining, and then our color table parameters. We can look at our tree. Yes, we have our two different scenes. And then for each scene, we have these color table parameters where we are changing our colors, and we can see what that appears as. So here's the viridis, and then we have our inferno, which isn't great with our black background, which maybe that'd be another good example because we can also change our background color. Okay, so then we get to our exercises, which I'll leave for you guys, and I'll open up pipelines. So pipelines are the ways that we can transform our data or input data that we get into new meshes. Users could specify geometric transformations. You could do field-based transformations. And then the result of these pipelines can then be piped to a scene or an extract to get that data then out of Ascent. So let's load modules, and then let's see, we'll create an example mesh. So we're going to move on from our TED example. We're going to be using this braid example that Conduit has built in. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a pipeline, and we're going to apply a single filter, and that filter is going to be our contour filter. So the action we want to apply is we're adding a pipeline. We want our data to flow through this pipeline and potentially change, and then we will then have it flow somewhere else. So we add our pipelines. Our first pipeline, we'll just name it PL1. Pipelines are composed of filters. So filters are, I guess, the modular parts of a pipeline that will then change our data. So we can think of the contour filter as what our data is going to flow through. So that's the type of filter that we're going to be applying. Contour has a couple of parameters it requires in order to execute. So it needs to know the fields you want to perform the contour on. It also needs to know what type of ISO values you want. So here we selected 0.2 and 0.4. And then, so that's our pipelines. Now we want to visualize the result of this pipeline and this particular filter in this pipeline. So to do that, we can set up a scene. So we have another action where we can add our scene. The really important part here, so we're going to do a pseudo color plot of braid, but the important part is that we hook up our scene to the pipeline that we created. So here we have our pipeline, and this PL1 is what is attached to this contour filter. So we need to make sure that we attach our scene to this PL1 so that data flows through that pipeline to the scene. So if we can execute that, we can see our tree. And then we can see what that looks like. So here we have a contour of braid, and maybe let's change some things to kind of see what ends up happening. So maybe we forget to attach it to our pipeline. What do we end up getting? Well, we get our input data. So instead of that data, it did flow through the pipeline, but that pipeline wasn't told anywhere to go. And so what we ended up rendering in our scene was our input data. Let's see, so we can change that back. Another thing that I like to do, it's one of my favorite use cases. I don't actually know how realistic it is for you guys, but one thing I really like to do is to transform our data based on one field and then do a pseudocolored plot with a different field and see what that looks like. So our data is going to flow through our pipeline. It's going to apply the contour field based on our braid field. And then we're going to render that new mesh that was transformed, but instead we're going to render on top of it the radial field. So we get something a little different. Okay, so here, let's combine a threshold and clip transform. So we're going to have a single pipeline again, but we're going to have two different filters. So first, our data will flow through filter 1, and then it'll flow through filter 2. So first we need to do is we need to create a pipeline for these filters to live. So we have our PL1, just a single pipeline. Our first filter is going to be a threshold, which takes a number of parameters. It needs to know the field to threshold on. It also needs to know the minimum and maximum values to keep the elements in between them. And then we can specify our second clip. So this is our second filter. So we'll specify clip. We have a number of different clips. Here we'll do a spherical clip, which has a number of specific parameters where we have to specify the center, X, Y, Z, as well as the radius. We also have switch. You can have it be either the inside of the sphere or the outside of the sphere. And then so we have our two filters of our single pipeline. Now we need to render the results of that pipeline. So we can add our scene. We will add a pseudocolor plot. We will render the output of our pipeline, make sure we pipe that to our scene, and then we will render out our braid fields, and we will give that an image name. Let's look at our tree here. So we have our pipelines. We have our adding our pipelines, and then we have our single pipeline PL1, and then we see our two different filters, and then adding that scene attached to the pipeline. So we can see what this looks like. So let's see, so this threshold is giving us this kind of cubist, and then we can see where the sphere took out the data in the middle. So for our third example, let's create and render multiple pipelines. So our first example, we saw a pipeline with a single filter. Our next example with a pipeline, we saw two different filters. So now let's create a rendering with both pipelines. So let's see, so we have our pipeline. Let's create our first pipeline. This will be PL1. We'll have it match our first example of our contour filter. We'll do the same parameters. We'll have it act on the braid fields with the same ISO values. And then we'll create our second pipeline, like our previous example, where we'll have the threshold filter as our first filter, and then our clip filter as F2. So let's see, so here, right, this is our second pipeline, so we'll specify that as PL2. Our first filter is threshold. We'll use the same parameters. Our second filter is clip. And again, we'll use those same spherical parameters. And then we need to declare our scenes. So let's see. So we're going to just render one image for both of these pipelines. So we're just going to have an S1, but we're going to have two different plots. So we're going to have a plot of our first pipeline. That'll be a pseudocolor plot, and we'll render the field braid. And then for our second plot, that will be our P2. That will also be a pseudocolor plot. That will be attached to our second pipeline, PL2. And again, we'll render our field braid. And this is just a single image, so we just need to give it one image name. You can see what that ends up looking like. So here we have our actions tree. So we have our pipelines, PL1, PL2. PL1 just has that individual filter, and then PL2 has the two filters, clip and threshold. And then we have our scenes, where it's an individual scene, but we're adding two different plots, P1 and P2, of our two pipeline outputs. So we can see what this looks like. And yep, it's a combination of our two images. We have our cubist and clip plus our kind of honeycomb braid. And then we have our exercises. So that is it for pipelines. I'm going to hand it over to Emily to go over extracts.
So, extracts give you the ability to capture data that was produced by Ascent and pull it out to be used outside of the Ascent pipeline infrastructure. So this can be done in a couple different ways, like saving to different file types like HDF5 files or YAML files, or by creating cinema databases, which I'll explain in a second, or by running things like custom Python analysis scripts. So getting into the examples, we're going to do all the same imports that we did previously, but note this extra import that we're doing for the Cinema Jupyter widget. This will be useful in the Cinema example below, and run. And then for all of these examples, we're going to be using this braid mesh. So we're just going to define it up here at the top. Now, in this first example, we're going to do a really basic example where we just save all of the input mesh and all of the fields to a blueprint HDF5 file. So the way that you do this is you define your Ascent run, you publish your mesh just like you did before, and then you add this add extracts action. And in extracts, you have to define the type of extract that you're doing. So here we're going to do a relay type extract. And all that means is that we're going to be saving data to the file system. And then we're going to give it a path. So this is what our file is going to be named. It's going to add a .root extension in this case that you don't have to worry about adding yourself. And we're going to set the protocol to be blueprint mesh HDF5. You can technically put just HDF5, but by saying blueprint mesh HDF5, you're being more specific that you want it to be a blueprint formatted HDF5 file, because HDF5 files are just a generic binary file type. Although both will work the same in Ascent, supposedly, according to Cyrus. So then we're just going to print everything out to visualize it. So let's run this. And as you can see, our extract looks like it got set up correctly. We're going to close it and check that we got this out export braid all fields file. Looks like it exists. It's right here. And we can't run visit inside of this Docker instance. So what I'm going to do, and I don't expect anybody else to have Docker installed, or not Docker, to have visit installed or up and running, but I'm just for demonstration purposes going to download that file and pop over into visit, which hopefully you can see. Open up this file and just come over here to pseudocolor mesh, and you can see that it's loaded in all of these fields from the mesh. So if we draw it, we can visualize the braid mesh in visit that we created over in Ascent. So that's really cool because you can kind of move things around a little bit more than you can directly with the Ascent like Jupyter Notebook, or if you're not using a Jupyter Notebook, then that gives you a visualization method. So now adding in some more modifications, let's say you only want to save one selected field. You want to save a little bit of memory space. And so this can be done really simply by just adding this extracts params fields and appending the field that you want to save. So here we're going to be saving the braid field. And if we run this and check that our file got generated, it's right here. I'm going to download it again and open up visit. And I want this one field file. So now if you look under pseudocolor mesh, you'll see that only the braid field got saved, unlike before where we had, I switch back, we had braid, radial, and velocity magnitude. So And if you look at it, it's the same exact mesh that we have right now. It's just only saving that one field. So another thing you can do is you can save contour results to HDF5 files, and you can do this by using the pipeline functionality that Nicole just talked about. So here we're going to be creating the same pipeline that was in the previous example, and the same, or previous example in lesson 5. And then we're going to be using the same extract that was in the previous example, but now we're going to be adding this pipeline 1 to the pipelines. And so when you run this, you can see you've got your pipeline here, you've got the pipeline linked, and when we visualize this in Ascent, or in Visit, this one, I'm going to download this, come back over to Visit, and open up this braid contour. I can now visualize, sorry, just those contours using the pseudo-color plot. That's okay. So those are a couple of the things that you can do with extracting to HDF5 files. You can do all the same things by extracting to YAML by just replacing this blueprint mesh HDF5 with YAML or other file types. So next we're going to talk about cinema image databases. So probably haven't heard of cinema, but this is a post hoc visualization tool that allows you to, the way that this is set up is you will extract images of your plots at multiple different angles to be able to visualize the mesh after the fact. And Cinema provides some functionality within Jupyter for us to open that up, but it also, if you're not in a Jupyter notebook, it makes an HTML file that you can use to visualize the plots as well. So here in this example, we're going to be using the same pipeline that we were using in the previous example, but this time instead of adding an add extracts action, we're going to add our scene. We're going to define the scene that we want to plot and the plots. And then to use Cinema, we're going to be using this render functionality and calling Cinema, and then setting a couple angles at which we want to visualize the mesh. And so here, this combination of 5 phi angles and 5 theta angles is going to result in 25 images being saved. So if we run this, what's going to happen slowly is we're going to have all of these angles that we can see in our Ascent viewer that got saved out. And you can also see the cinema databases directory that was saved with all of the images that we just generated. And also, if you weren't in a Jupyter notebook, this index.html file that you could use. And then we can use inside Jupyter notebooks this CinemaSci cinema viewer. So if we run this by pulling the database path from the Ascent info, we can load this database, and it provides this user interface that you can visualize all of your plots. So I'm going to make the image bigger for us, and we can oscillate through all of these different phi angles and theta angles just to be able to see this plot in, well, 3D. And so the advantage of this is that images just take up less space than serializing the entire mesh. And so this means that you can save more frequently throughout your workflow and gain a better understanding throughout your run of what your data looks like. Close that. And this last example we're going to talk about is extracting to Python. Now this might seem a little bit silly because we're already in Python in this Jupyter notebook, but a lot of simulation codes are written in other languages like C or C++ or Fortran. And what's happening here is that Ascent provides this embedded Python environment that supports custom analysis and can run Python even if your simulation isn't written in Python. And the other advantage here is that when using NPI, this environment supports distributed memory processing, where there's one Python interpreter per MPI task. So in this example, we're going to be defining a Python script that creates a histogram of our mesh data. So just defining the min and max, creating some bins for our histogram, and then using NumPy to generate the histogram. And it's gonna spit out all of that information to the output so that we can look at it. And if we run that, we can see that it's created this histogram with these counts here, and also here's all of our bin edges, right? And we can also see that it generated this out hist results YAML file right here, because we told our histogram to save there. So you can insert this Python script into your Ascent workflow. So here we've got on the side, I think it's this file, the Python file, all of the same code that we just ran, but it's now saved into a file called Ascent Tutorials Python Extracts.py. And when we're in Ascent, we can add an extract that has a type Python and call that Ascent Tutorials Extracts braid histogram.py file, and it will run it within our Ascent run. So here you can see that we generated this outpy extracts hist results file from running this. So we've got two of these files now. We've got the outpy extracts hist results and outpy extract. We had two files. Yeah, out hist results and outpy extracts hist results. So out hist results was the one that was generated when we were just running the straight Python. And if we compare these two files, that's what this box is doing, it will show that these results are exactly the same. So now there's an exercise. I'll let you guys work through that on your own. I don't remember if Cyrus or Nicole is after me, so I'm going to pass it off to one of them to talk about Ascent queries.
I guess as you're going through these different notebooks now, we've showed you some pretty complicated ways to combine things, right? So you start with scenes to make pictures, and then from that you have pipelines. Pipelines can be put both into pictures or they can be put into extracts, right? So the idea here is you have these composable tools, and a lot of use cases you want to do in situ are reducing the data. So whether it be making a picture, which is a lot smaller than your giant data set, or whether it be doing, say, a contour or a slice or something like that before you go to HDF5. And when you have these building blocks, you can kind of plug them together and make that happen. Another way you can reduce data is with queries. So queries give you kind of a summarization mechanism, right? So I want to ask some questions about my mesh. I'm not necessarily thinking about getting a mesh back or a new field on a mesh or changing the mesh. I'm thinking about doing some aggregated thing. So and then queries are also the foundation for what we have in terms of triggers, which Nicole will be covering. So again, this will be another thing that we're adding here. So we had add scenes, add extracts, add pipelines. We're going to have something called add queries, spoiler alert. And then those are going to be kind of named expressions that we execute that do some summarization. So let's get moving. So the very first example we're going to show here, we have this data set, which you'll see in a little bit. It's called the double Geyer data set, which is basically a little vortex. And we're going to ask some questions about it with our query infrastructure. And basically inside of Ascent, we have this embedded DSL, domain-specific language, that implements these different capabilities. So the simplest thing we can do, we're going to add a query. The simplest thing we can do is we can ask the cycle. Cycle is a common metadata thing that's published by simulation codes, right? It's kind of like their internal counter, as opposed to time, which time is usually meant to represent physical time. Cycles like an incremental counter for how many loops the simulation's done. So we can ask for that. And the second question is a little bit more complicated. We're going to calculate a histogram of this Geyer field. And so this is a function that will be implemented in the expressions language. And then we're going to take the entropy of that. And we give things a name, right? So in this case, the entropy of Geyer is going to be what we call it. We're going to render here, but in rendering here, we're just showing you what this data set looks like because you haven't seen it before. But the reality is that you're going to see this query information, and this query information is going to be giving you kind of succinct values per time we execute. So so this is going to be our scene here. And then we're going to run this. So the Geyer example changes over time. So we're going to run this for several time steps, and we're going to keep publishing the updated data to Ascent and then calling our actions, right? So so yeah, so here we go. Let me run this. It'll take a little bit of time. So here's our actions that we have here. And then these are our results that we're getting out. So time 0, cycle 100, we get this. Time 0.5, cycle 200, we get this. So you can see we have this structured data here that gives us our histogram results. And the interesting thing about the histogram is it doesn't just give you the arrays, right? It also gives you the bounds and all those fun things. And then we also have our cycle. So this is a lot of text output. Fantastic. We can grab this from our info and we can print it again. Or we can access this information from basically, this is how Ascent indexes it internally. What you really want to do is you're going to want to plot it with something like NumPy. So before we do that, I haven't showed you the data set. This is what it looks like. And we can see it's kind of a simple, it's basically swirling, but it's also moving a little bit. So this just creates a time varying example that we're able to play with a little bit, right? So once we've done this, we've executed Ascent over several time steps. This example shows us basically just grabbing that information, and we're getting that information via kind of the info API call that I talked about for Ascent, and we're transforming that in a way we can plot it with matplotlib, right, in the Jupyter notebook. So we do that, we have this here. So we get initial entropy is low. For whatever reason, it jumps up really high quickly, and then it kind of stabilizes off. So that's just some property of the data. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Nicole to take us to the triggers. But the trigger exercise builds on this. So you want to take it over, Nicole?
Okay, so yeah, triggers are a fun one. They're one that I can't help but use the word in the definition. So it's a set of actions that will be triggered when the result of a Boolean expression. So the kind of use case for this is you've instantiated Ascent in your code, and maybe you have Ascent running every cycle that your simulation runs, and maybe that's too often. So you could go into your code and you could hard code it to maybe execute Ascent over every 10 cycles, or if the data does something interesting, but now you have to recompile your code, you have to do a lot of extra thought, whereas Ascent is going to give you this capability. So so for our first example of a trigger, we just want to, we'll set a Boolean expression, and when that Boolean expression is triggered, we're going to make a rendering. So let's see. So like Cyrus said, we're going to be building up on top of our queries infrastructure. So we're going to be asking questions about our data, and then depending on the answer, that will determine whether or not we've activated our trigger. So here we'll add our query. So our first query is going to be an expression. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that Geyer data again. So we're going to specify that field. We want to create a histogram of that field with the number of bins, and then we're going to calculate the entropy of that histogram. So we'll have the output entropy, and then we can add our triggers. So we can base our trigger off of this query. So let's add a simple trigger that just fires at cycle 500. So we can have our first condition. So our first trigger, we'll set the condition to be if cycle, that internal call to that counter, when that equals 500, let's call this action file. So this is an Ascent actions file. You're probably like, where is that? Oh, it's been here the whole time. If you go to the left, you can find cycle trigger actions and click on that. So what we see is it's just a scene of pseudocolor for our field Geyer. So once this trigger is activated, once we hit cycle 500, it will call this Ascent actions file, this external file that you could change whenever to do whatever you want and not have to recompile. So it'll call that, and then you'll get an image, or it'll do whatever the action file declares. So let's also define a second trigger. So this will be based on that entropy expression that we declared in our first query. So let's have our trigger 2 condition be if our entropy reaches a certain value, or excuse me, if our entropy increases. So we also have this history functionality, which will keep we'll keep the previous results of previous cycles. So here we have our entropy. We'll look at the history and we'll look at the relative index. So it'll look back one cycle and it'll compare the current entropy to the previous entropy. And if that exceeds 0.5, awesome, we've hit our trigger. We've triggered, and then we'll call our entropy action. So again, that has been here the whole time. So if we look at this, okay, so if our entropy triggers, again, we just want to render out an image of our Geyer field. So let's go back to our triggers and let's trigger these babies. Okay, so here's our action. So we first define our query that sets up our entropy field, and then we have our triggers, our first trigger being trigger when we hit cycle 500, and our second trigger being trigger when our entropy increases from the previous of 0.5. So now again, we see all that output from our query. So we're getting our cycle and our histogram. Go down, down, down. See what we get. Okay, so yeah, so we LS to see if our image was made at cycle 500, and it was. That's great. So we have our cycle appended to our image name, and we can see what that looked like. Lovely. And then let's see if our entropy image was also made. Okay, yes, and that was output at cycle 200. Let's see, and there it is. And then we can print out our expressions to YAML as well. So then there's exercises, but I think Cyrus is going to take you guys through binning.
So binning is the last focus topic that we want to cover. There's also some extra examples that I think you can probably do on your own, but we want to describe this a little bit. So so we'll focus on binning. So data binning. So data binning is kind of a cheap way to explore your data. So you can use it to look at things spatially. So you could say you can bin things spatially based on, say, X or Y and collapse in Z, something like that. But you can also use it to bin things based on the distribution of a scalar value. So you could do something like density versus temperature or something like that. So it's a flexible tool. You can think of this as like a multidimensional histogram. One of the things that's a little bit different about a histogram is you can have different options for when things fall into a bin. So usually in a histogram, you're counting things, or maybe you're summing things to get a distribution. In the binning functionality that we have, you can also do things like average, or you could say get a variance, etc. So with some creativity, you can do some cool things. These examples here really focus on spatial binning. And you know, this is a kind of a there are some limits to this, right? If you oversample or undersample, you can get some strange looking things. So if you look at the binning docs, that describes it a little bit more. So I won't go into all the details here, but just thinking about how to use this as a useful tool. The other thing that's nice about binning is if you have different inputs data sets and you want to put them on a common basis, if you set up the bounds right, you can do that. So if you wanted to compare 2D to 3D, maybe even cylindrical coordinates to 3D coordinates, you can do some fancy things to get them all on the same basis with some pretty cheap operations. Histogram is a very cheap thing to do it in parallel even with MPI context. So we'll show you some binning examples using back to braid now, our other favorite example. And when we run binning, you can run it a couple different ways in Ascent. We're going to run it as a query. So, and there's also a way to run it as a filter. So why would you do one or the other? If you want to run it as a filter, which I don't think we show here, there's a way to plot that data back on the original mesh, or to plot that data on a binning mesh, which is kind of a, you know, putting the spatial attributes back on. But in this example, we're just going to think of it as, you know, we're going to consume it as a set of YAML outputs, right, and plot them. So again, we're going to add queries this time. Our queries here are going to be 3 different types of binning. So a one-dimensional binning, so basically if we specify one axis, then everything's going to be projected along that axis. And if we do 2D binning, we specify 2 axes, and then it will be projected onto that. And then the 3D case is actually interesting. So it's 3 axes, but then we end up getting you know, a single, basically kind of like a single line out because of how we've selected the parameters. So this is using a sense expression language to call these functions. So binning's a built-in function. We have different reduction operations. Here we're doing max on everything, but there's other things you can do like sums and averages, like I said. So let's run this. Here's what our queries look like, and then here's the results of our binning. So again, everything here is pretty well described in terms of what happened, and here's the values. That's a lot. So let's take a look and plot them with matplotlib. So if we look at the 1D result, this is a picture we get. So again, we collapse this along one axis. We were binning something called, let's see if we go back up here. We're doing radial on all these, and radial, as you might imagine, is kind of a pattern that varies, like going out from the center in a spherical manner. So that's what we see here whenever we get this. So we start with something low at position 0, and then as we go out, this pattern gets higher. That's just you know, the synthetic data, what it does. We look at the 2D result similarly, but we're going to plot it with matplotlib using a kind of its own pseudo color plot, right? We can see this radial distribution. If you remember in the first example, I plotted this and it looks similar to this inside of Ascent. And then for the 3D, we'll plot that as well. It's actually a line because of how we reduce things down. It's not actually, you know, we did it 3D in space, but it ended up being projecting out to a single line that looks similar. Similar to the original one, but a little bit different parameters. Okay, so that's binning, which is an advanced query, or you can also use it as a filter in a pipeline too. Extra examples are fun. So I mean, if you're wondering some of the other things that Ascent can do, you can play with these. But we're not going to go through them right now. I would like to stop. So first I want to thank Emily and Nicole. So thank you very much, and everyone for joining. And we have plenty of time for questions. We'll hang out. We'll leave these instances up for a little bit. They'll probably be torn down in about a half hour or so. But if you have any questions, you have a captive audience. So ask us now.